Okay,
All right. And then do you want to try sharing your screen again so you can see if it works?
I'll do my best. So can people see that? Oh,
Mm, no.
yes. No.
Not at the moment, no.
Oh, okay. Let's try again. Share. Uh-huh. Share. And then- Can you see that? No?
I
We
can see the main screen with the
yeah.
My screen says, well, you know, your pictures are to the right and it should say narrative analysis, like the first slide of a PowerPoint.
Yeah,
We
we can
just
we
see
can see your whole desktop, kinda. There is a
Oh,
big picture behind it and
oh,
backup
okay.
slides. So not
Why did that not? Yeah, okay. Let's
if you click on the
when I clicked on from current slide, it then moved it to my other monitor. Hang on a minute. Let's try again. Let's just let's see if we do it that way. Share. Uh,
okay.
yes,
Now we see it.
yeah, does that
yes,
look good?
yes, excellent.
And you right, okay. Rightio. So, well, thank you very much for coming. My plan today is just simply to very briefly talk through some of the different approaches that fall under the rubric of narrative analysis. Basically to show you what's available, and then you can, for your own purposes, decide which sort of narrative analysis, which bits of which tools you want to use. Far be it from me to say you actually have to use any of these things, but so and please ask questions as we go along. You don't worry about interrupting, but speak because you've suddenly been sort of shrunk on my screen, and I might not see people's hands raised if you click on that. So just shout at me. That's perfectly acceptable. Okay, so now to analysis, and it's not moving. Let's try again. No, why is it not moving? Okay, okay. I'm going to have to get out of it. Oh, there we are. There we are. Okay. So the first few things I want to just say are things, they're fairly commonsensical. You'll probably have all come across it, but they're just important to remember before we get into the types of analysis we do, because some focus on different elements. So stories are told at all levels of life. The individual. We all tell stories about our lives and things, and you know, you know, we tell ourselves stories about what's happening. We tell other people's stories about happening, with us as the focus. But we all grow up, or most people grow up, surrounded by stories of their family and friends, that their close circle, that stories about who they are, what they're doing, what it means to be part of this family, for example. Um, and we learn sort of what stories are available to us, what stories are acceptable, which types of stories are taboo, from growing up into an environment a narrative environment that does this. And then, of course, at a wider level, there are the community stories, what it means to be part of a group, a much bigger group. So an example I use from England is that in 1984, there was a miners' strike, and it got, under the Thatcher government, and working class mining communities, the stories that kept them together are stories of solidarity, of never breaking strikes, of strength of union, and that sort of thing. And during that strike, a number of miners broke away, formed a separate union, became, and Thatcher used that as leverage against the mining communities and the National Union of Miners. And like 20 years later, the people who had, the miners who'd broken away were still referred to as scabs. This notion of, they broke the strike, they betrayed the community. So these sorts of community stories are very strong and very long lasting. And then surrounding sort of community stories, we have, the bigger societal stories, what it means to be British, Canadian, Turkish, wherever. That, what are the sorts of stories that it mean that bring a particular social and societal understanding to life, the universe, and everything. And even sort of bigger than that are the big sort of narratives, the grand narratives in sort of postmodern language of, the enlightenment, of progress, of science, and the development of the individual, things that are, less tangible but still have a story. And so, of course, individuals are surrounded by multiple levels of stories, which we can usually, find traces of when we interview people. And that's an important thing to remember when we come to analyze data. And, of course, these stories are not each level of stories is not discrete. They all interact, and the stories at each level help shape stories at other levels. We as individuals are shaped by all of these types of stories in one way or another, and they're called outside-in stories. Gary Kenyon and Bill Randall talk about inside-out stories and outside-in stories. Outside-in stories are the stories that get told about us, or stories that we allow into our own story. Either consciously or unconsciously. But at the same time, we also tell stories out into the wider world. We tell stories about ourselves and other people and society, etc. And, stories are not just sort of passive objects that just get placed in the world. They have an impact. They can change how others view things, how, so for example, the growth of, the Me Too movement, inside out stories, more of those stories became available, and, community and social awareness of those stories grew. And so we can change, and that's important. Again, hopefully all our sort of research has that sort of impetus that we, as qualitative researchers, we tend to collect individual stories, but then rework them, reshape them, and put something out into the world in the hope that, wider stories might change. So these different levels and these different interactions are important. The other thing I just want to make, again, it won't come as any news to you, but narrative called the storytelling triangle. But basically, all our research is a relationship. The data we collect is a relationship. That any story told is a function of the relationship between the author, i.e. the teller, the reader or the listener, and what they're telling. That, people tell stories in contexts, and those contexts shape what the story, or what story gets told, and the form of the story that gets told. If we talk, if I talk about, my career, if I talk to my peers and my friends, I talk about basically, very serendipitous things and opportunities taken and, good luck. I get this job because something happened and, it was just by, coincidence or serendipity that it happened at the time. When I go for an interview, I tell a much more structured, planned, agentic type of, this is the career I've been working on and this is how I've shaped it and the like, rather than, oh, that sounded fun at the time, so I applied for it. Yeah. We shape our stories according to who listens to them. Yeah. And that's important because in our interviews, when we come to analyze our data, we need to think about how our participants are responding to our questions. If you've got video of the interviews, how are they responding to us? Our body language, our presence there. So there's just a couple of things I want to emphasize before we start, because these impact the stuff. I'm not going to go into any great detail about narrative theory and the role of theory and why narrative is so great. I'm just assuming that people know that sort of thing, or at least are interested enough to want to think about narrative. Okay. So narrative analysis takes many forms, and it's better to think of it perhaps as a set of tools, and you apply these tools, according to what you're trying to achieve. I'm very sort of eclectic or messy in how I analyze stuff, in the sense of, I tend to think about what works or what provides insight into these data, rather than I'm only doing one form of analysis, whether that be thematic analysis or linguistic analysis or whatever. And I'll come to that shortly. Okay, so here I'm going to present sort of 4 narrative approaches to data. I'm going to very briefly talk about each of these, and then I'm going to offer some sort of ideas of how each of these types of analysis might help in the analysis of the data for you on Muslim masculinities. Again, I am not pretending that, expecting you to say that, this is the way to do it. I wouldn't presume to impose any of this on you or your data. It's just simply me offering you these ideas, take them up, discard them, do what you want with them. If they're not helpful, don't use them. Okay. The first thing is Donald Polkinghorne makes a distinction between the analysis of data, the analysis of narrative and narrative analysis. And this is a fairly fundamental distinction, because the two are very different. And while people talk about narrative analysis a lot, they sometimes lead these two together, and narrative analysis becomes almost a catch-all for almost anything you want to do. So the analysis of narrative is basically you have narrative data, whatever those data are, interview data, written stories in books, whatever it is. Yeah. And many qualitative studies claim they're doing narrative analysis of this type. That now there tends to be, I believe, some sort of confusion or at least sort of lack of clarity. It's that we often see in the literature claims to be doing narrative analysis when they are actually analyzing narratives. And even then, they may not be analyzing narrative data. Narrative analysis just becomes this substitute for qualitative analysis. But qualitative data are not necessarily narrative data. So we just need to be aware of that when we read stuff, and again, how we want to present it. The analysis of narratives is if you have narrative data, it involves basically breaking them apart. So a very common form of narrative of analysis of narrative is thematic analysis. You look for themes, issues, patterns, concerns, etc. I'll come to this in a minute. Yeah, and so individual data from interviews are compiled, put together with data from other, and we say, well, a common theme is, I don't know, the avoidance of conflict. It doesn't really matter, yeah, and we put all the data together, yeah, but in doing that, we lose the sense of story. Yeah, we're just looking at themes and patterns and things. That's a perfectly acceptable way to analyze narrative data. I'm not poo-pooing that at all. Yeah, but it's important that is what we're doing. We're breaking apart narrative to identify patterns or whatever within interviews and across interviews. Or the use of language. What sort of language do people use? But we don't get any necessarily context of it. I don't know if anyone has seen the film Zidane. It's a movie about a French footballer. And all it is during I think it was one World Cup match, the camera, the whole movie is made up of clips of Zidane during those 90 minutes of the football match. Right. So you get a good sense of what Zidane is doing, but absolutely none of the context. There's a picture of him running. Well, you don't see that he's running to intercept a ball or anything like that. Yeah. It's all been cut apart and then put together as a movie Zidane. Props analysis of Russian folktale. Vladimir Prop wrote a very famous book on the morphology of Russian folktales, and he analysed the different types of character, the different plots, the different events in a corpus of Russian folktales, and said there are basically only 9 characters and 12 plots or 12 events, and they're all just combined. Yeah. You get no sense of what any of those individual stories are. So that's about the analysis now. And we often do this. We collect our data and we code and then we bring together all the stuff we've coded in according to one particular thing and look at that and ask what it tells. The one code, of course, does not tell us much about the narrative. The narratives that the data came from. And the different types of this analysis of narrative that makes, there's the thematic analysis, and we do thematic analysis within and across interviews. Yeah. So interview data are coded either in vivo, we start with a transcript and code what people say, and we build up a coding frame from the transcripts, and then we refine that through. We do open coding to start with. We code everything. Axial coding, we cluster things together and look for those clustered types of code, and then we hone it down. And in the end, we're only coding for certain half a dozen codes at most, sort of thing. And we engage in constant comparison. We do one interview, we do a second interview. If there are new codes in the second interview, we go back to the first interview, and then we go to a third interview, and so on. Yeah, but the purpose is to look for patterns and things. We might do linguistic analysis of how data are presented, the use of we or I, signifying in groups, out groups, agency, the confidence. We might look at active and passive language. Are people actively engaged in things, or are they more passively recipients of things? So I'm currently doing some work on spirituality, and I look at do people passively accept the story world of the religion or the faith path that they're part of, or do they actively create a story world, a religious story world? Eakin says, all stories are rhetorical. And it's good to bear in mind, even if you don't do rhetorical analysis, that, to ask the question of why is this person telling me this story at this point? Yeah, this is, they're telling me for a purpose. They want to present themselves in a certain way. They want to convince me of a certain thing. They want to present, an identity, etc. And it's, I'm not suggesting this is in any way suspicious or, mendacious or anything. We all do it. I'm sitting here talking about Natalie, and I'm, at least implicitly trying to persuade you that I know what I'm talking about. And we can look, but it's also, if we actually do rhetorical analysis, it's about ethos, the credibility of the author. How do our participants present themselves as credible raconteurs of whatever they are talking about? Yeah. How do they, so that's the ethos about the credibility of the author. And it's important to bear in mind because, if we're going to base our research on people, we need to have some sense that what they are saying is either reliable or at least, at least that they believe it. And most people do. But and I'm thinking of I did a piece of research on individuals who identify other than humans. So they identify as animals or fictitious mythical creatures or whatever. And I interview these folk who identify as wolves, and they'll tell me about their wolf type life and all the things they do in their wolf type life, and what they tell me about their claim to identify as a wolf is borne out by things they do in their observable real lives. Others they tell a story, but it seems to have little impact on their day-to-day life. So I interviewed this one person who believed himself, identified as a god of light. And for him, he fought these sort of mega demons on the astral plane every night. Now I have no way of checking whether that's, true or not. But apart from him recounting it to me, this is what he does, it didn't seem to have any impact on his real life, his day-to-day life. The wolves were all involved in wolf-type charities or conservation or education and the like. Because they identified as such. This guy basically didn't move out of his mum's basement. So there seems to be a disconnect between believing this and acting this. Rhetorical analysis is also about the reader, the appeal to the emotions of, or the prior interests of, or the dispositions of the listener, and how people are doing that. And you can look at the narrative techniques people tell to persuade you. I like this type of research, but I'm not sure how useful it is in this view, unless you're thinking about how people present, how they deal with masculinities. Structural analysis: how do participants structure their stories? Is there a genre here? So I'm doing a piece of work on first-person accounts of leaving cults to see if the structures of these stories and the tropes they use and are strong enough to say, actually, this is a particular genre that needs to be identified as such. How do your participants talk about masculinity? Is there a sort of a wider shaped, a wider story to which they conform? So, for example, it's in the stories of Alcoholics Anonymous. The research, quite a lot of narrative research that's done there says there is a template that you fit your story to. It's a genre, that has certain features that you can't stray away from. So in terms of AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, you have to tell a story of abstinence. You have to tell a story of being an alcoholic, even though you're a sober alcoholic. Stories about moderate drinking, controlled drinking, being cured. Those don't fit the genre of AA type stories. And then we all do, and then positioning analysis. How do our participants position themselves vis-a-vis others? So they always position themselves according to the researcher, how they perceive us. What Bill has the same of how listeners shape what tellers tell. So we need to be highly reflective about what positioning work are participants engaging in when they talk to us because of who we are, and we don't have a lot of control over that, but it can be quite evident. Bill and I did a piece of research, and we were interviewing Pentecostal ministers, and I had a young female RA of no particular faith who was doing some of the interviews, and I did some of them. And it was noticeable in some cases that the pastors saw Callie as fair game to be converted, and it was sort of and they overtly sort of say, we would like you to give yourself over to Christ, sort of thing. So they're positioning their talk as a way of recruitment in effect. Whereas, me being older male Catholic, yeah, they never tried it, never tried even suggesting that I might, want to join them. Yeah. So they position themselves according to who we are. They position themselves according to their group. So they might tell us some things that, they may not want the group to know. So I had one pastor who, was, I mean, we were talking, and he referred to Donald Trump as the nearest thing to the Antichrist he could think of. And then he says, but, you mustn't tell my congregation this. Yeah. So he positions himself out, as outside, slightly outside of the congregation because of this view and the thing. Yeah. So, how do your participants position themselves according to you, the researcher, other men, societal groups, etc. Now, these are not mutually exclusive. We pick and choose, and and I would argue that you choose what is most suitable for you according to what you're trying to achieve. Yeah. I don't tend to worry that I pick up one or two things from linguistic analysis and then one or two things from thematic analysis and rhetorical analysis and put them together. My view is let's look for whatever insights we want here. And if we have multiple tools, we'll find multiple insights, hopefully. Yeah. So, for what it's worth, my advice, you don't, I certainly don't get bent out of shape about trying to, rigorously apply one form of analysis. Going back to Polkinghorne's distinction, against the analysis of narrative of all those different types, he poses what he calls narrative analysis, where rather than breaking data apart, you bring data together to write a narrative that brings out the importance of whatever it is. So, for example, Blue Blonde Langner did a piece of work where she interviewed and observed children in hospital who knew they were dying. The book is The Private World of Dying Children. And for her PhD, the book's from her PhD, but her PhD is basically a 3-act play. She wrote a play based on the data in order to bring out the emotion, the drama, the struggles, the ups and downs of knowing of children who know they are dying. Yeah, and as such, it was presented as the analysis. She could have done a thematic analysis and said children think X, Y, and Z, and these are the issues. But what she did was she wrote this story in the form of a 3-act play. And again, the or Doxiadis' PhD came out as a book called Logicomics, which is basically a graphic novel of the life of Bertrand Russell. Again, bringing things together into a story. And narrative analysis can embody live experience, can coalesce meaning. It provides a frame for understanding events. And stories, narrative analysis doesn't have to be an individual story. It can be a composite. you could write a composite story to him, to capture the richness of your data, the emotions, in order to present this lived experience in a way that's more sort of vivid than perhaps a thematic analysis might be. Building on this, we have, we can use narratological terms, narrative theory, to look at data. So, this narratological analysis is the use of narrative concepts basically from literary criticism and the like. Okay. So we can look at narrative arc. How is this story presented as a story with a background, a rising action, a climax, a falling action, and what sort of story is it? What sort of plot is it? Booker would say there are seven plots, major plots, overcoming the monster, rags to riches, a quest, a journey, this sort of thing. How do people see that? How do they emplot their lives? And then plotment is the configuration of events, time, events, places, and actions in order to bring out the dramatic or emotional import of the event. So, and some people emplot their stories as tragedies and as victims, as others emplot it as like a quest of always searching for something. Others might do it as a sort of a redemption story. Art Frank talks about redemption stories where things were bad and they are now good. I have changed, I am redeemed. And that can give us insight into the author, how they tell stories. And this notion of authorship and readership is important. Narrative theory says, we can look at both the author and the implicit or the inferred author. So if somebody, in our interviews, they will obviously tell us about themselves. So we have we have data about who they are, but we can also infer things about who they are by what they say and how they say it. So I give an assignment to my students about this. I give them a lengthy excerpt from an interview, and ask them to sort of analyze it in terms of what can they say about this guy, and they'll often pick up on the obvious stuff because that he tells them this, that he's the head of this UFO he's the director of the headquarters of this UFO religion, that he used to work in the wine industry, all the general autobiographical information. What they don't necessarily pick up is that that he recounts stories about his interactions with friends, of leaving one country to go to another, and he expresses concern about letting people down or letting and we can make inferences that that he's a good friend, he's articulate, he's educated, he's concerned with social justice. He never tells us he's concerned with social justice, but he tells us about volunteering at St. Martin in the Fields, which is a big homelessness project in London. And there are multiple examples of that sort of thing. So, oops, I want to go back. How do I go back? Oh, no, oh, bother. Oh,
I
no,
think if
no.
you press the back arrow on your keyboard,
Nah, it's not doing anything.
Not working?
No. And if I click my mouse, it moves it on again. Hmm.
Like, I have a question while when you are
Please.
done with this, yeah.
Yeah. Go on then.
Yeah. So the question is about, yeah, that one is,
Yep.
as you said, analysis of narratives, right? And
Yeah.
and the other one is narrative analysis.
Hmm.
So, for example, in this project, Muslim Masculinities, we are collecting stories of those men who are engaged in gender justice movements and who are supporting gender justice and who are part of the different local, individual, communal initiatives of prevention of violence against women, right? So this is, and we are collecting stories, as you know, from them. So it seems that right now what we are doing is in terms of our analysis, a little bit which we did from our prior studies, that comes under analysis of narratives,
Mhm.
in which we are coding and we basically because we have questions, and through those questions, multiple stories are emerging. So we are analyzing those stories. So that is some sort of, I would say, analysis of narratives. So now, and we use, I don't know if you, this is another kind of follow-up question on that. Would you consider Fraser method as analysis of narratives more closer to than narrative analysis? So the difference would be then when I compare it to narrative analysis, that then we are looking into individual or multiple stories in various forms, constructs, and as you mentioned, like in different phases and meaning making from their stories. Yeah, can you a little bit elaborate on this? If I'm on the right track, or is there any?
I mean, yeah, most work using narrative data would fall under what Polkinghorne would call analysis of narrative.
Okay.
We have narrative data and we look for patterns and themes and concerns and the like. And we put together all the data that fit with that code or that issue or whatever. Yeah. And we say, a common concern across interviews is X.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
absolutely fine. You know, uh, you know, loads and loads and loads of really, really good research does that. Yeah. Narrative analysis would say, well, okay, that's fine. You could write a story incorporating those data about the life of somebody engaged in gender justice. And you could make it a composite. So an example would be, I did this, or I'm still doing this piece of work on body integrity identity disorder. People who want to acquire a physical impairment, usually an
Yeah,
amputation.
I remember that. Yeah, you've been working on it. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the outputs we did was to create a comic,
Okay.
right? Which isn't any individual of
Hmm.
these. We drew bits from multiple stories. We created a character and told a story about the character and his desire to acquire a physical impairment. And we're now following that with the second comic, which takes it through to him acquiring it and the aftermath. So the narrative analysis is that people read a story about a guy,
So it's like a
but then understand.
like a story, like a story of stories.
Yeah, it's this is simply about this guy who, has these feelings that he doesn't want his leg, and it explores ways of forcing an amputation, of the implications of that, how he finds information, etc. So, the reader, just like you read a novel, you engage, you get transported into a story. Narrative analysis was, this transportation. When you read, I don't know, Tolkien, you get transported into Middle Earth. When you watch Star Trek, you get transported into the Star Trek world. When you read Pride and Prejudice, you're back in whatever century Britain. Like, yeah, yeah. And
Okay.
so it gets the reader engaged in a story, not reading about stories.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone, if you have, is it clear or any questions around that? Because this was a very core concept. Okay, yeah, we can move forward then.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's all right. Yeah. So the narratological analysis is that we use these narrative terms to understand how people are saying what they're saying, etc., and how they make sense of their experience. You know, do that. Do they plot being engaged in gender justice? As a quest or a redemption or overcoming a monster, these sorts of plots that might apply. The evil monster is the gender injustice they are engaging. Yeah. And again, it's about how they shape their experience. Yeah. So we have that. We then move to what I would call narrative hermeneutics. This is the slide before the one you could see, but you won't miss much. Hermeneutics is this interpretative activity. Yeah. And narrative hermeneutics is how do we interpret what we experience, what we see, whatever, through a narrative type of lens. And I'll give examples in a minute. But the idea is that we understand ourselves to the degree we understand the stories of which we are a part. Remember those different circles and levels of narrative. Well, to understand the individual, we need to understand the family stories, the community stories, the societal, the discursive ones. Yeah. And so we start thinking about the individual through those different lenses and different levels of narrative, which comes to the slide. Hopefully you can see the 3 levels of hermeneutics. Now, the first level, and this isn't an absolute necessity to agree with at all, but there are some authors like Stephen Kreitz and David Carr and Jerome Bruner who argue that all experience is in some way narrativized, that we don't, that, there isn't, we immediately interpret things. There is no pure experience separated from interpretation. Kreitz would say that experience has a narrative form, a narrative quality. Yeah. Now, people disagree with that, and that's absolutely fine. What's more important is the second is that once we have the experience, once we experience stuff, we start making sense of that through a narrative process. we compare what's happening to us consciously or unconsciously to stories we have known. We locate experiences into our narrative environment. So an example from Art Frank would be Art Frank tells this story of they've taken his mum to see a movie called Shanghai Nights. An awful movie. Don't waste your time watching it. But he took his mum, and it's basically well, it's a movie that's set in the American Wild West with lots of martial arts fighting and a bit of science fiction thrown in. Okay. And apparently for like the first 20 minutes of this movie, Art's mum was just confused, didn't understand it at all. But after 20 minutes, she turns to Art and says, "It's a comedy." And as soon as she could place this movie into a narrative form and a genre, it started to make sense to her. She knew how to react to it. She knew, not because it all sorts of weird stuff happens that doesn't really make a lot of sense unless you see it as a comedy. We do this, something happens to us. We rely on our previous stories. Is this an example of our previous story? So my PhD was on a form of child abuse called Munchausen syndrome by proxy. And Munchausen syndrome by proxy has, I don't know, 15 indicators that contribute to a diagnosis of Munchausen's by proxy rather than something else. So, a doctor is faced with a circumstance, if the doctor can say, 14 of these 15 characteristics of Munchausen's derived from previous Munchausen's cases and stories apply in this case, I'm on relatively good ground to say that this is a case of Munchausen syndrome by proxy. Helps make sense of what's before the doctor by relying on previous stories. If it only met one or two of those criteria, the confidence in this being a case of Munchausen's would be far lower. Yeah. So we locate new stuff in our in our pool according to the pool of stories that we have. Yeah. And we all do this. Yeah. But it's about understanding our experience through narrative. Understanding, we use narratives all the time, I don't think of the last, job interview you went to, the last one I want, where do you see yourself in 10 years' time? You've got to tell a story. You have to think about your life and your trajectory, or how does this fit in with your plans and your emergence, whatever. Yeah, and there's an expectation that certainly I think there's an expectation in those circumstances for you to narrativize your experience. I have moved through this. I am now in this position to apply for this job, and I will go on to do. And this job fits into this trajectory I see. Yeah. So we tend to make sense of our experience, and that's one of the things about narrative hermeneutics. We use narratives to make sense and to express who we are, to communicate with people, all of these things. And then the third level of hermeneutic is basically what we do as researchers, but we can ask participants to engage in it. We reflect on that narrative process. We tell a story about the story. Yeah. whether it be a thematic analysis type story, a dramatic three-act play, a conference paper, and the like. Yeah. And that in some ways, in inverted commas, adds value. It adds that sort of another layer of narrative understanding to the phenomenon that we're engaged in. Now, yeah. So we might do this hermeneutical analysis. No, didn't like that. Okay.
I hear.
Yeah.
Can you go back? Oh, we can't. Okay,
Oh well, I'm
no
not sure
problem.
how to go back. No, that's going forward.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so here in hermeneutics, like what you were saying, yeah. So, so in which level you think?
There we are.
Yeah,
There's a little
yeah.
backwards
Thank you.
arrow right at the bottom of my screen.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Okay, so in terms of reflection on the narrativization, such a big word, process, uh, are we talking about also context here, like historical context here?
No, this would be us doing this
Oh,
narrative interpretation. Now we might be interpreting it through a historical context.
okay,
But we need to understand the level two hermeneutics of how do these people make sense of their experience, and we can reflect, and we can ask them to reflect of how does the context involve, impact this, shape this. Yeah. But
yeah. For example,
yeah.
sorry, yeah. For example, like we are getting stories in terms of interpreting religious text in different ways. And that interpretation of Quran or the Prophet Muhammad life, they are has been interpreted in multiple ways, right?
Hmm.
So, and now that person who is he is interpreting accordingly in culturally and historical context. So here hermeneutics is playing a role here.
Yes,
Yeah.
because we're understanding our current position
Hmm.
through other stories, and we're reflecting on that, whether they be stories of you know, you know religious worlds or political regimes
Yeah.
or whatever.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. And so, I'm going back now. Right. So this sort of leads to this is that I think there are multiple ways of approaching hermeneutics, and I think even though we may not say it's what we do is hermeneutics, I
Yeah.
would argue that a lot of it is.
Mm.
We are interpreting things
Mm.
we're not simply just accepting it and saying that's it. We are making sense of how other people make sense of stuff. Yeah. Narrative hermeneutics is how do we use narrative in doing that? So one of these things is what I would call story world analysis, is that I argue that we all exist in one or more story worlds. Story worlds are those sorts of, the worlds in which stories circulate that shape how we think and what we think about and how we experience stuff. A clear example, I'm doing this work on faith, spirituality. The Pentecostal story world, Pentecostal Christian story world, is very cut and dried. There is, God created the world, humankind fell and are sinners, and then through God worked through history, sent Jesus to redeem humankind, to be the sacrifice that's required to reunite humankind with God. Jesus rose from the dead. There will be a judgment day. I'm like, yeah, yeah. So that's the story world, and it shapes how people experience life. You know, if you believe you are a dependent, sinning child, you know, which is inherent in that Pentecostal story world, yeah, you're going to interpret, you know, wanting another drink potentially as sinful, you know, um, you know, interpreting losing your temper as not being, as being sinful, as not living up to God, to the model of Jesus Christ. Yeah. Um, yeah. Now I would say we all carry, and we might operate in different story worlds, but we all have these things which help shape us. So, for example, you know, in the transcript that Sarah sent me, you know, the guy, and I don't know, I haven't got the code, but refers a lot to the Quran and to that sort of story world. Yeah. Now, I'm not saying, you're in a much better position to say, but does that sort of worldview story world, shape how he is responding, how he understands himself, his actions, etc. So I would argue, going back to the hermeneutics, we understand ourselves or we understand others to the degree we understand the stories of which we or they are a part of. Yeah. So we want to know what this story world is, this narrative environment which helps shape people. We can also look at the types of stories people tell. Art Frank has this concept of what's called companion stories, stories that we carry around in our heads as guides to action or reminders of things that that are of importance. And in his book Letting Stories Breathe, he gives lots of examples. I personally like this one. It's this very short. A guy called Tony DeMello was a Jesuit priest, and he used to tell stories all the time. And he has this one of which I adapt to fit me. It's a story about this guy who has parachuted out of a plane, and he gets caught in a tree, and he's sort of dangling, 30 feet up in the air in his parachute. And in the original, it's a priest, but I always like to think he's as as an academic. He's walking past, and the guy in the tree calls out and says, "Where am I?" And the academic priest just looks at him and says, "You're dangling from a tree." And the guy dangling from a tree says, "You must be an academic, must be a priest or whatever." And the guy says, "Yeah, how do you know?" He says, "Well, what you told me is absolutely true, but equally useless." Yeah. And I carry this around me to remind me that no matter how great I think my ideas are, they're not necessarily useful to anybody. It just acts as a reminder to be a bit more humble about stuff. It's a companion story for me. Yeah. Other people will obviously have other ones. And it's sometimes interesting to see what sorts of stories people carry around with them that help shape their activity and shape their thing. Don Quixote in the Cervantes novel, his story world and his companions were stories of medieval knights doing chivalric stuff. And so he was out there doing chivalric stuff himself. They were companion stories. What stories mean things to your participants that can help them along their way, help them make their decisions, help them continue their work in gender justice and the like. Signature stories are stories that we tell about ourselves, almost like a calling card. This is me. Yeah, and they're usually quite short and slick and not many ums and ers, and we tell them all the time, but they tell us something about the teller. Yeah, they want us to understand them through this sort of story. And shadow stories are stories that are sort of hinted at but never explained, which raises you why not. And if you've got an opportunity, you might want to ask people about them, but quite often we don't have that opportunity. And then narrative mapping. Stories make sense in relationship to other stories. So if somebody tells us a story, what sort of stories might it be attached to, aligned with, resonate with? Yeah. What stories does it jar with? Yeah. And so we sort of locate stories in this sort of, metaphorical map of things that are closer to and things that are further away and like. And then this is Ken Plummer, sociologist from the UK, talks about the sociology of stories. What are the natures of it? He says that some stories, act to oppress, to silence, to marginalize other stories. Other stories are more liberatory, empowering, and like. So what's the nature of the stories we're being told? Yeah. And I'm going to hint at some of the things why this might be helpful later. The production of stories. Who produces stories? How are they produced? How are they distributed? Some voices are louder than others. Some stories have far greater resources in which to produce them. Yeah, and what does that say about the power dynamics of stories? To what extent do subaltern stories actually get heard? Who consumes stories? How are they consumed? Who has access to certain stories? Yeah, and all of these things. Who tells stories? How are they told? Strategies. All of these sort of help us look at the power dynamics of stories. What are the power dynamics between stories of gender justice and gender injustice, or the historical stories, or how is the message of gender justice work spread abroad? What resources does it have to produce these stories, or is it a marginalized activity? Who gets to consume it? In academia, it tends, less so now, but certainly historically, academics consumed academic work. There wasn't even any real requirement for us to produce anything other than academic work. Perhaps we need to think about the consumption of stories. Certainly, when we write our work up or present our work, to make so that there is a larger consumer pool than just academic. Yeah. So this, social stories allows us to think about the power dynamics involved in the production, the type of story, the production, the consumption, and how stories are told. So, how might this help? Now, I'm just throwing these things out. If you don't think they're helpful, they'll be helpful to you. Fine. I'm not saying you have to do any of this. But thematic analysis helps because it's an overview of commonalities and differences. so you can get a broad view of my tendency is to do very close analysis of individual or very small numbers of case studies. My last article was on 3. I've written things on 1. Yeah, that's my preference. Yeah. Now, thematic analysis allows you to have a lot, because I think you said you've got multiple countries and multiple data collection points. You're going to have what 100, 120 interviews, or I don't know. I mean, however you've got. This thematic analysis allows you to see the commonalities and differences across participants, both within a geographic area and across geographic areas. My work would never allow you to do that. You just haven't got time, and it's not something yeah. And depending on your aim, you identify issues and concerns across the board. Yeah. You look at patterns, and of course, a thematic analysis allows, if you have a standard coding frame, you're in a really good position to compare data. The sort of work I do, it's really hard to compare data. Yeah, so perhaps thematic analysis is the main way to go. You're going to find out the different, how people understand masculinity and the plural of masculinities, what forms of each of those there are, what are the concerns and the challenges and hindrances to gender justice work across the board, within country and across countries. Yeah, so thematic analysis strikes me as a very strong contender for the project. But we might also think about, incorporating some things like positioning analysis of how people talk about how they position themselves and how they position others, because that might give us insights into what opportunities and hindrances are there for further work, joint work, for building alliances. Yeah, identifying opportunities for change if change is needed. Yeah, so understanding how individuals and across the research population, about how people are positioned and do positioning work might open up those possibilities for further work. Linguistic analysis might give insight into the sense of agency and nothing. Do they use passive voice more than active voice? Do they use I or we? Linguistic analysis helps identify who constitutes us and who constitutes them. Again, that might open up the thing of, looking at alliances and joint work, etc. Sentiment analysis may give insights about how people see these issues and see, are they confident in addressing things or not confident? Are they suspicious about certain things? Are they, hopeful about certain things? You can run, interviews through, software that will do that sort of basic sentiment analysis. And it gives you an idea of how people feel about these issues. And knowing that might help, again, identify, work that needs to be done. If the body of your participants, sentiment analysis suggests that the majority of participants in the study are lack confidence that this will change much. Well, perhaps that's the grounds to think about ways of addressing that as an issue.
Like, if we can conclude in 5 minutes, so we will have 5 minutes for Q&A.
Oh, okay. We better just go to Q&A then. I mean, you've got these are just ideas of throwing in what I've got from previously. Yeah. So composite story, which we mentioned, hermeneutics, how identities and practices are shaped by the bigger story world. The types of stories like companions might give insight into how people act, what strengths they can draw on, limitations, and the narrative mapping puts insights into multiple stories and understand how these operate, and it might give insights into opportunities and hindrances to change. I'm sorry. And that's it. We'll have questions.
Thank you so much, Clive. It's fascinating and very deep stuff. I hope you will. The recording is there, so I can think about myself that I will be watching it again and learning it deeply in a more reflective manner. Any questions?
Of course, we will go through the recording once, and yeah, like so far, we have no question. But for the even further deep study, I think we might have. So we may. Can we come up with follow-up questions, though?
Absolutely. Just email me. Hang on. If I can work, I'm not very good with this.
You can, one thing in an organized fashion we can do is if you could send your questions to Sarah, and Sarah will compile those questions and send it to Clive. So in that way, whenever Clive get a chance, he will respond to those questions and then we can share with you all. Does it make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Okay. Clive, this just one thing is this. You mentioned about thematic analysis, right? And you spend a little bit time over there. And yes, we are using thematic analysis. Uh, and then you mentioned about a few other like position analysis and other. Can all of the others could be in some ways part of thematic analysis?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
A theme could be, you know, um, you know, participants use the passive voice.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is
Yeah.
it's linguistic analysis, but it's
Linguistic.
presented
Yeah.
as this is a commonality across
Oh, okay.
whatever. Yeah. Or a theme is, I know, we are the good guys.
Hmm.
Yeah, which is about positioning.
Oh, okay. So all
Yeah.
of these could be part of thematic analysis in
Oh,
some.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just trying to tease them out in order to
Oh,
try and explain them. They're not mutually exclusive at all.
okay. I have another question, but before that, I want to give space to others if you have a question.
I think just a comment that I have, not really a question, but I really liked when we were talking about like listening to the tone and like the kind of like the like you said, like positioning, kind of understanding the tone of the participants. And I think that's something that's really important in our study because it's such a sensitive topic. And so with a lot of our participants, like really recognizing like, okay, well, when this topic is brought up, they kind of maybe they talk in a hushed voice, or maybe they get really angry when this point is brought up. And then you can kind of see like the passion and the emotion, and that all helps in our analysis. So that's something that we should kind of pay close attention to.
It is, I think it's really important. I mean, I had one guy in study on dementia, ethics and dementia, and I interviewed this guy who was caring for his wife who had dementia. And if you read the transcript,
Hmm.
at times you'd think he was a completely heartless bastard. If you listen to the transcript and watch the video,
Yeah.
he's actually being
Yeah.
sarcastic or ironic.
Yeah.
But you don't get that from a transcript.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So listening to, I mean, I always encourage my RAs when they look at read transcripts is to listen to the tapes as well,
Hmm.
because you get that tone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So my question is that there's a kind of critique of using thematic analysis for analysis of narratives. That analysis of narratives should have more stories and resonated threads from the stories, and it will be more story centered.
No,
So thematic analysis.
thematic
Oh, sorry.
analysis can be applied to stories.
Yeah.
Quite, fine. It can be applied to other qualitative data.
Yeah.
Yeah. It can be applied to observational data. It can be, and that's absolutely fine. It isn't a critique of thematic analysis. Thematic analysis can be applied to all sorts of data.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's often claimed that, you know, you know, you'll read an article and say they're doing narrative analysis, and they're not. They're actually doing analysis of narrative.
Yeah.
And even that is tenuous because the data they are using is not narrative.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not a critique. It's, the research is absolutely fine.
Yeah. Right.
I just like the clarity of this is what this is. Don't get it muddled up with something else. Yeah. So you can, even if they're not telling you stories all the time, the example I saw, there are periods of the stories and the periods of not stories. The not stories data is absolutely fine for thematic analysis. Thematic analysis is very flexible in dealing with multiple types of data.
Yeah. Just a tool of organizing it in such a way that
Yeah.
you can
Yeah.
learn.
Whereas narrative analysis is really difficult if you don't get much story.
Yeah. Exactly.
It is possible. My PhD supervisor did narrative analysis with parents who had learning difficulties. And Tim says he has hours of tape with this guy, and the longest answer he got in hours of tape was 3 rabbits and a ferret. And that was it. That was the longest answer he got. But he was Tim was exceptionally talented. He managed to create and write the story of this guy's experience from all of these very short non-narrative data.
Yeah. And we are struggling the same with you, Sarah, right? Then there were from Saudi Arabia, we got interviews, those were 15 minutes
Yeah.
narrative interview. So then we were kind of struggling that, okay, there is not much into
There's not
it.
much to do.
Yeah. So yeah, some of them, not all, but like some of them. Yeah. Okay, I think the time we are right at 11:30 now here in Calgary time. So just want to thank Clive. Thank you so much for your time. I know you are a busy person, and I think very few in Canada are basically at that level in terms of Canada research here and working on narrative and analysis of narrative. So we are blessed to have you in our session, and we learned a lot, but we still need to look into it again, watch it again, and reflect in deeply and apply it in our analysis, in which we will be doing in the next few months. So we are very grateful as a team.
Thank you for the
Thank
opportunity.
you.
I love talking about this stuff. So
Yeah.
any opportunity for me.
Yeah. And thank you all, everyone, for
Yes,
joining
thank
us today. Thank
Thank
you so much. Take good care of yourself.